Good evening. On behalf of the San Antonio Book Festival, the San Antonio Public Library, and the Library Foundation, it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event, a conversation with former city manager Sheryl Sculley. If you haven't done so already, we encourage you to get a copy of the book by selecting the green button below. You can place a hold on the book from the San Antonio Public Library, or you can purchase a signed copy directly from the Twig Bookshop. At the San Antonio Book Festival, we bring readers and writers together, virtually these days, but we unite them to celebrate books, ideas, literary culture, and of course, libraries. If you're interested in more events like this one, please visit sabookfestival.org to learn about our upcoming events, like our discussion next month with journalist and Latino USA anchor Maria Hinojosa. Thank you so much for tuning in. Enjoy the program.
Good evening. I'm Amy Hone. I'm the Executive Director of the San Antonio Public Library Foundation. The Library Foundation is thrilled to be partnering with the library and the Book Festival to bring you this presentation this evening. The San Antonio Public Library Foundation's mission is to strengthen the library in service to our community. Never has that mission been more important than now as we recover from this global crisis. Free and open access to information is something that cannot be underestimated as we rebuild our community. The libraries have always been engines of change and centers for people to come together. The Library Foundation takes our responsibility very seriously in helping the libraries stay viable, visible, and vital. And that's why we are so thrilled to be a part of tonight's program. Thank you so much for being interested in this and for participating, and we hope that you join us for many more programs in the future.
Good evening. This is Ramiro Salazar, Director of the San Antonio Public Library. The library is proud to be partnering with the San Antonio Public Library Foundation and the San Antonio Book Festival to bring you this evening's program, a conversation with Cheryl Scully. Ms. Scully, former city manager of the city of San Antonio, published a new book titled Greedy Bastards, One City's Texas-Sized Struggle to Avoid a Financial Crisis. Ms. Scully this evening will be talking about the book, and it's a timely topic as there's a lot of conversation throughout the country regarding the role of police. Ms. Scully is a well-accomplished city manager. She served the city of San Antonio for 14 years. Prior to that, she was the deputy city manager in Phoenix and city manager in Kalamazoo, Michigan. She is well known and respected in the circles of city management and public administration. She has taught at the LBJ School of Public Affairs in UT Austin, and she is now retired after 14 years of serving the city of San Antonio. She will be interviewed by former city council member Rey Saldaña, who served 4 terms on the city council for the city of San Antonio. And currently, he is the CEO and president for Communities in School, a national organization that promotes students staying in school. Mr. Saldaña is a native of San Antonio. He was born and raised in the South Side, and he has strong roots to San Antonio. And during his term as council member, he was a big champion for working families, promoting also public transit. In fact, he used to ride public transit to experience what his constituents had to experience as it relates to challenges in getting and moving around the city. So we're glad to have both of them for this program, and enjoy the program. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy, Lily, and Ramiro. Good evening, and welcome to all of you for joining us today for this special online event, a conversation with Cheryl Scully. I'm Rey Saldaña, and I'll be moderating tonight's program. I'm excited to be here today to participate in this event, really because of all the profound work that's happened with the San Antonio Public Library in my experience in San Antonio, and of course, as well with the San Antonio Book Festival and the San Antonio Public Library Foundation, who are helping put this together and bring this event to you tonight. These organizations are a treasure to the San Antonio community, and thanks to their hard work and dedication, we were able to put the event and the program together for tonight. So as many of you already know, I had the privilege of working with Ms. Scully during my time on the San Antonio City Council. I joined the City Council in 2011. And as we're going to get into, Cheryl came to San Antonio in 2006. I'm honored to be able to join her and to discuss her book. Just got through it over the last few days, so I'm excited to dive in, jump in. And as we get started tonight, I'd like to introduce our guest of honor, Miss Sheryl Scully. Cheryl, are you there?
I am here. Thank you, Ray. Thank you so much for interviewing me this evening. And my thanks as well to the Public Library, Ramiro Salazar, as well as the Library Foundation and the San Antonio Book Festival. Happy to be a part of this program this evening.
Well, I just am loving the opportunity. I've now, of course, I'm the president and CEO of Communities and Schools, a national nonprofit all across the country. But to take the evening to get to jump back into the world of San Antonio, specifically the walls of City Hall, and to see it from an angle that not many have. After they read the book, they will see the angle from the office of the city manager, of which you were in charge of really running and operating the city for 14 years. And I want to just say this to pretext this conversation. As somebody who ran for office and you want to try to understand the political world of San Antonio, the business of the San Antonio organization, it's sometimes difficult because you don't have a lot of resources. You certainly have, I think, newspapers that have written about San Antonio's history and experience, especially the political history, and then you have the people who have lived it. So today, really, we have the opportunity to do both. We have the primary resource, which is the legacy of this book that you will leave behind to future city managers, city council members, or citizens who want to get a sense of this snapshot of San Antonio. We're also speaking to the person in charge who saw it from an angle that, of course, not many people got to see. So we're grateful that we get to jump into the book. I spent the last few days getting through it, enjoying it, recalling some memories, some that I had forgotten about by choice. I'm sure that is likely the case for you. But I want to start where I think a lot of people start when they see the book, which is, of course, the title. And Cheryl, you and I spent a lot of time in one another's respective offices, sometimes wondering how it was that the newspaper landed on a specific headline. And I think folks want to know, how did we land on the title for, or how did you land, of course, on the title for Greedy Bastards?
Yeah, Greedy Bastards, one city's Texas-sized struggle to avoid a financial crisis. As I say in the introduction to the book, I can't take credit for the title. It was inspired by the police union president in one of his early interviews, which I think turned into an ad or something on social media as well. But he criticized my team and I for trying to characterize the union as greedy bastards. And I remember the first time I saw that back in 2014, we all kind of laughed and said, oh my gosh, that's not what we're trying to do here. However, if I ever write a book someday, he just gave me the title. And so here we are in 2020, I'm publishing the book, and I held on to that and I explain it. And I used it, Ray, and for our audience, I used it for two major reasons. Clearly, it was said to try to malign me, but I used it because it was a hardball experience, and the title reflects the experience that we had. But it also demonstrated how far the union would go to protect what they had since 1988, even if it meant harm to the city. It also reflects how dirty the fight got. But I think that's important, and that's really the purpose of the book, a bit of a history lesson for those in San Antonio, but also instructional for city managers, elected officials, and communities across the country that are facing some of these very same challenges.
You know, Cheryl, as I was reading it, and I think you comment this at the tail end of the book, but for those who are picking it up and getting through the first few chapters, you tell the story of how San Antonio got on your radar and how it was that you were working in Phoenix as the assistant city manager, if I think the title is correct, but the number 2 essentially in that organization. And something that I think readers will find interesting, and the fact that if you think about your career, it wasn't that you wanted to write a book specifically about one of the main components of the last several years of San Antonio, if you've been reading the headlines, which was around police and fire contract negotiations. That wasn't even the biggest issue that you thought you'd face when you got to San Antonio. But I want to sort of pull something out, which was before you came to become the city manager in San Antonio, you were told as you were being recruited that the San Antonio folks who were looking for this top job didn't want an internal candidate. And I wonder if you could, walk the viewers here a little bit about that experience, about being recruited to San Antonio, how it was that that went through 2 rounds, because the first time you actually had to turn down the offer. Tell us about that experience, because it was certainly a new city and police and fire negotiations were nowhere on the radar. But here you were thinking about taking this job and leaving Phoenix and coming to San Antonio.
Yeah, so when I was recruited to Phoenix, I was city manager of Kalamazoo, Michigan, a city of only about 100,000 people. And I went to Phoenix as a deputy city manager, and then actually competed for the city manager's position there. And my city manager there retired in less than a year after I went there. And so I competed, I was a finalist there. They selected an internal candidate, and he offered me the number 2 position, the position he was in. So I never thought that I'd leave Phoenix. I really wanted to be the city manager there. It's the largest council manager form of government city in the country. San Antonio is the 2nd largest. Dallas is number 3. But when San Antonio called, the search firm told me that they were looking for an outside candidate and a tremendous amount of change. But I was always cautious when I'd hear from headhunters because there weren't very many women as city managers nationally. And I'd been in the business for quite some time, but I always questioned whether or not they just wanted me in the mix because they needed to have a woman in the mix, or whether or not they were really serious. And so I'd go through a little process of really questioning them when they'd call and ask about me. And San Antonio quickly passed the test. They said that they were very interested in me. So I did interview in 2005. Mayor Garza was mayor at the time, but there was an election coming up in May. 2 sitting council members running for mayor, Carol Schubert and Julian Castro. And I asked to meet all the mayoral candidates. I didn't meet Phil Hardberger because they said he didn't have a chance to win. And there he did win, but I had already turned down the position before that. So then Phil courted me over the summer, and I did agree then to come to San Antonio.
So here you are, and I'm walking through the book here. Here you are, you've just taken this job. You've decided that you're going to move your family from Phoenix to San Antonio. But upon arriving here, there was a few things that really colored your experience for the first few months. I was hoping you would sort of walk through that. I think a few of the pieces that came through are things that were out of your control. Hurricane Katrina was happening at that same moment. And you talk a little bit about that experience, but then you just talk about how bad of shape the organization was in, things that most folks wouldn't see.
Yeah, so let's see, I was appointed in late August, and then Hurricane Katrina hit right before Labor Day. Should have been an omen in terms of the kinds of challenges that I would have here in San Antonio. Nonetheless, I did come into San Antonio at my own expense that weekend. I wasn't officially starting until early November, but I came in to help Mayor Hardberger and the staff team on the recovery effort. And we went to all of the shelters here in San Antonio. I was really overwhelmed with how wonderful the community was in receiving people from New Orleans. We had more than 30,000 people in our shelters. So we spent time working on that. And then I decided that I would come into San Antonio every other week, Friday to Monday, to find housing and to get some things going, because there were quite a few vacancies at the executive level at that time. Some interim people in the positions, but a lot of department head positions that were vacant. And the police chief was retiring, had announced his retirement. I was able to convince him to stay until I could find his replacement. But yeah, there were a lot of issues. And I'd also, on those visits, try to meet some key people on those weekends as well. And I can recall sitting over in the Hyatt Hotel having a beer one Saturday afternoon with Teddy Stewart, who at the time was the police union president. And we hadn't met, but I knew it would be important to meet him as well as a list of a number of people from the community. So I was coming in often, and then the week before I started officially, I came in to unpack boxes and get myself situated before I began officially. I went into the office that Monday morning and I never left City Hall. I never did unpack those boxes. There were a lot of problems that we had to deal with right away.
Well, Cheryl, I want to get into something that I think is an interesting component of the work, which I don't think a lot of folks appreciate, which is the sense that you're always on in this work. I mean, you manage a large organization, the city with 40 departments, from parks to solid waste to you name it, the things that I think folks take for granted, whether it's around streets or drainage. You run an airport, a huge organization. And so I want to just comment about one thing that maybe you'll give me some experience of what you've had. But as a council member, sometimes the moments you remember the most are when you get those calls late at night from an unknown number. And that is, in most cases, you're getting a call from Chief McManus, and it could be 2 or 3 a.m. As a council member, you deal with, I think, a tenth of that because you get a call only when something happens that is going to either make the papers the next day or be on the news. I can recall getting calls like that late at night, but I was only representing 1/10 of the city. You were managing the entire. Tell us about what that's like that folks may not have gotten when they get through the book, or stories you may not have been able to tell.
Yeah, well, police and fire for that matter. I've, as my husband will attest, I sleep with the phone plugged in next to my bed and have done that for more than 30 years. Being in this business, because you do get calls at all hours of the day and night. There are no weekends. Being a city manager is a 24/7 job, whether I'm in town or somewhere else. When you get the call, you have to be prepared to address the issues and be there with the staff as you deal with issues. But it was frequent. I'd hear from Chief McManus. He'd be out at a scene and explain what the situation was. We'd talk about who would need to be notified, how we would proceed with the situation. And of course, he's done an outstanding job. Bill was one of the first people I recruited and appointed here in San Antonio, with the help of the community, I might add, because I was from the outside. And I considered internal candidates within the department as well as external national candidates. I had 4 of each, but I did put together 3 community panels of people from all walks of life, from neighborhood associations to the union president, to chambers, to business, to the gay lesbian community, to LULAC, to the NAACP, just people from all walks of life. And the candidates, all 8 of them, circulated among the 3 panels. And of course, I interviewed all 8 of them one-on-one. Not to select the candidate. I didn't want the community to do that, but I did want their feedback on strengths and weaknesses of those candidates to give me further input in the process. I will say, though, that even though my staff said, you can't go outside, we tried that once, it didn't work, I thought the internal candidates were not as strong as some of the external candidates. And that evening, when I had dinner with my 3 executive assistant and deputy managers who chaired the panels, they said, oh my gosh, you have to go outside. Our candidates didn't stack up. And I suspected that might happen, but it was good to hear that from not only my staff, but from the community. They unanimously said, wow, you need to hire Bill McManus. He was the best candidate. So those kinds of examples of making sure that you're fitting into the community in the right way, not coming in saying this is how it should be done, but rather seeking out input from the community as you go into that kind of process as well.
Well, I can remember many days, evenings, weekends when, I would drive by City Hall and obviously see your car parked there either late at night on Sundays. And it's the kind of job that even I'm sure when you are trying to take vacation, you will still get calls. And so I sympathized when you were commenting about being stopped at the grocery store or being told about potholes while you're trying to get your workout in. There's some days when I'd be walking my dog down the street for a walk and people would just yell at me speed bumps and sidewalks the entire time. So the job that I think you've had for 14 years was sort of an encompassment of those kinds of moments throughout your life, throughout the experience here. And so I actually wanted to ask about one of those components. So as a council member, you're one of 10, and you've been in this business for 40 years. The question that I got from folks who knew I was going to be having this conversation was ask Cheryl what it was like when you go through elected official after elected official, and a lot of us coming in having knocked on doors and talked to constituents who want a ton of things. And you as the manager of the organization having conversations with council members, in some cases bringing them up to speed, because the history of the city is that we want to do it all, but you have to play this balancing act and work with council members who are coming in. So what's that experience like working with, I think you quoted 43 different elected officials, at least in your time here in San Antonio?
Yeah, 43 different city council members and 4 different mayors. It is well, first of all, the city manager's job is to run the day-to-day operations of the city, hire all the staff, in some cases fire staff that are not performing, but certainly address disciplinary issues and implement the policies of the mayor and city council and the direction. In that process, it's also about developing recommendations and strategy to help council members be effective, because my job is to help the council members be effective for the residents in their communities. And when there's so much changeover, when new people come in, sometimes they have a totally different agenda or a different idea as to what they want to accomplish. And in a big organization like the city of San Antonio with 13,000 employees, 40 different city departments that, as you said, do very different things, from run the airport to fix streets to manage parks and recreation to run our fabulous library system, to manage public health, social services, the municipal court. I mean, it is a highly diversified municipal corporation. And in doing that, with new council members as they come in, sometimes council members would think they had a really good idea as to what the city of San Antonio does, but they would get into their office and realize that it is quite complicated. And it would take a few months for council members really to get up to speed, even on the policy issues that were at hand, what we were addressing, what we were trying to accomplish. And so my job was also to work with council to make sure we were addressing what was most important to each council member, but at the same time, keep the vision and the concept of what are we trying to do to move the entire city forward. It's important to address neighborhood crime issues, to make sure that a library branch is constructed in an area where residents don't have access to a library, to maintain the parks, to do all of those things. But in the end, what are we trying to accomplish in the big picture for the city? And with 2-year term limits, it makes it hard for council members because they're running almost all the time. It takes a few months to get up to speed. They're in office for a year, productive, and then they're running again because they have another 6 months until their next election. So that makes it difficult. And for staff, we, as you know, would plan out our agendas and policy discussions and council action 6 months out, so that we didn't have everything, all the controversial issues on one meeting, but we had them spread out. Sometimes we couldn't manage that timeline. It would happen as needed, but we would project out. And because there was so much turnover on the council, there was 1 or 2 years where we would ask each other, okay, who's going to be here in 3 months, or who's going to be here 4 months from now when this policy progresses to the point we're ready for council action? Will it be the same people we're working with today, or will it be a whole new group? So it makes it quite complicated. It's a very diverse power structure, and it's ever changing in San Antonio. And that's somewhat unique to San Antonio. I'm not aware of another city that has as frequent elections and turnover as San Antonio. In fact, when I talked with a number of people in the business and city management across the country when I was considering coming here, several people cautioned me and said, "Are you sure you can be effective there? Will you have enough continuity among the elected leadership to get things done?" As by comparison, Phoenix is larger than San Antonio, but I worked with half as many council members there in 16 years. So having in 2 4-year terms, I think would be excellent for the council. Then you're not also fundraising every 2 years, or because that's difficult too. You have to spend so much time to get reelected. So it's a complicated process, and one that is added work for the staff, but necessary because there are so many changes.
Yeah, actually, there's a quote in the book that you describe around which I completely agree with, having been through this situation, which is that there is a tendency for elected officials to think in short term. What can be accomplished and done within a year or 2 years, even if it's not, say, fixing the foundational financial situation the city was in. And I completely agree. So thinking about that, I want to sort of take you back to 2011, which is really where you kick off this story about the issue and the contention that was brought up around the police and fire union and the back and forth that began. I remember sitting on the council when you presented the budget that year. And by the way, congratulations on being in August and not having to be shuffling through a city budget right now. This is what, I think, your second time. You don't have to, second year you haven't had to do that.
Yeah, I'm working on the pre-K for SA campaign, and I had a question for Carlos this morning. I shot him a quick text, and he said, "Hey, I'm in a council meeting." I said, "Oh, sorry, forgot about that." It's Thursday morning. He said, "I'll call you this afternoon."
For 40 years in the business of having to see this season as your high season, I think you can take some pleasure in knowing that other folks who you've trained are now working through those operations.
And they're doing a great job, by the way.
And I'm going to ask you about that towards the end, really about the coaching tree that you've developed of other city managers, both in San Antonio and around. But again, taking you back to 2011, I remember sitting in that budget presentation and getting a sense that this was going to be a different one, as I heard from, at that time, Mayor Julian Castro, who said, look, there's going to be a portion that Cheryl talks about that may raise some eyebrows, but also speaks a lot of truth about the financial forecasting that we need to be honest with if we are going to continue to operate the city and do all of the things that, I remember the conversation, you all want to get done. I wanted to work on a park on the south side, and another district councilman wanted to work on a senior center, and all those things required funding and resources. And you presented.
And we did all those too, by the way.
And we were able to accomplish, which, if you are getting the book, for folks, we may not cover this, the way we've been able to accomplish the kind of bonds and deliver on them, the comparison you show from the previous to 2006 budget, I think, is like 300 million worth in the last 15 years. Now we're close to 2 billion worth of investment into our city. So all that to be said, okay, let me get my question in. 2011, you put up on the presentation something that shocks a lot of folks, which is that if we do nothing around adjusting our uniform healthcare system, then by 2031, we will only be funding police and fire and not have the parks or the libraries or the street infrastructure. And so shock and awe ensued. Can you just tell us about what went into preparing that presentation, knowing what would come?
Well, it was somewhat of an academic exercise, but the recession brought it to light for me and emphasized it, because we were collecting during the Great Recession less revenue year over year, and we weren't cutting police and fire. It's a core business. No council members wanted that reduced. I didn't recommend cuts there, but that meant with less revenue that they were consuming a greater and greater percentage of the general fund budget, and we had to make reductions in community centers and library hours and our street maintenance, things that the community views as important, and of course didn't want the reduction, but without a tax increase, we didn't have the revenue to be able to do that. And so my staff and I worked on this analysis to say, okay, what's happening here? If their expenses are growing greater than our average increase in revenue each year, when will public safety consume 100% of the general fund? And based on a 10-year history, that was 2031. Now, there were those at the time, you'll recall, Ray, that said, oh, that you're just being dramatic, that's not going to happen. Well, left unattended, it will. If we don't do anything, we're a growing city. We know we'll have to add even more police and fire personnel. But we also were adding branch libraries. We were expanding our park system. We were trying, and we did increase our street maintenance budget. So there were needs throughout the whole city, and we want a balanced city. I mean, we don't want to be 100% public safety and turn off the street lights and never mow a park again or close all the libraries. So we started early so we could set the stage for, here's the reason why we need to address those 25-year-old police and fire contracts, not to take things away, more so to revise and remodel the business model of those old contracts. I'm not passing judgment about what was done in 1988, but what I could say was that it was no longer affordable and clearly not sustainable if that was the track we were on. And I believed that there were ways that we could remodel the healthcare specifically, since it was growing the fastest among all the expenses in the public safety union contracts, that we could still provide very excellent healthcare for our employees, but have it structured differently, just as we had done with our own civilian employees. And we're paying now for our civilian employees competitive wages, but they're participating in the cost of healthcare for their dependents. And I think that's important, because healthcare costs are better managed if you have some skin in the game.
Yeah, I can recall that at the moment, what I think frightened a lot of council members to again speak to this question of what's most politically expedient, or what is something that is going to avoid pain for me in the future. And I'm thinking elected officials who are wondering, is the police or the fire union going to run a candidate against me if I don't get behind them? What I learned quickly, and I think you learned probably your first day, is if you want to accomplish anything, you have to be able to do a little bit of math, which is to count to 6. And you've talked about making sure you had the support of the mayor, but the timing had to be right in 2011. And the question you might have had with your staff is, can we count to 6? Can we make the case to the council to convince them of the pieces that you had just described? And towards the end of the book, you actually say that, you maybe underestimated the amount of time it was going to take, and it sort of drew out several years. But you mentioned specifically that if you would have changed something, it would have been about the way you communicated it or endorsed a communication plan. Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit more about what you meant by that, because I think some questions that I got from the audience were, what would she have done differently if she could?
Yeah, I think that we should have had a very formal, structured communication plan that was adopted by the mayor and city council. I'm certainly not naive. I come from a union background. My father was a union member, a union leader. I worked in Michigan the first 15 years of my career, one of the toughest labor states in the country. I have a lot of experience working with unionized labor, and I'm not anti-union. However, the situation here was really out of control. This was excessive by any metric, as we found with our legacy task force. And I thought that if we had a data-driven, transparent process, that we could all talk about this and understand what needed to change. There I was mistaken. The unions dug their heels in from the very beginning and refused to participate in any conversation about the need for change, and put out a lot of propaganda about how we were attacking the rank and file, the people that protect us. And that wasn't the case at all. As you know, I dedicate the book to our first responders who keep us safe, and also to the community, because we did this for San Antonio. I didn't want to leave that financial legacy. No one before me had tried to change those 1988 contracts to get them in line. And I felt that I was in a position that I could work on that, to do that. Before I left, I thought it might take 2 years. I knew it would be very hard. I didn't estimate that it would take 6 years to reach a conclusion, but I think that they had so much time to put out such negative information and to demonize me, because that's exactly what they did. You may recall, we did put on social media, publicsafetyfacts.com, trying to put out the right information so that people understood how many officers we have. I recommended, and the council, you and others approved, adding more than 650 police and fire officers during my tenure as city manager. And that's new positions in addition to filling all the vacancies. So I started, in addition to that, I'd talk with different organizations, and they'd ask, when I'd explain what was happening, they said, well, that's not what we're seeing in the media. Can you send me a memo or a letter or something that explains this so I can use it with others? And that list of people grew over time, over a couple of years, to more than 500 people. The media started asking for it, state elected officials, business leaders, neighborhood association presidents.
I want to ask about that.
And I was sending it out informally, just to say, this has been said, here are the facts in the situation. So much so that the union even had complained, I recall, to the mayor, that I was putting out information. I said, here's facts. People are asking me, what's the true story here? But they just didn't want the information out. I think because that 1988 contract was so controversial, and of course the police union president at the time ended up being indicted and went to prison for taking bribes from the legal fund that happened as part of that contract. They just didn't want all that talked about or exposed. And I knew that if it were done privately in a quiet conference room, we could never get the kind of change that was needed. And so I brought the negotiations to City Hall. And we briefed the media ahead of each negotiating session so that they knew what would be discussed that day. And the union viewed that as throwing down the gauntlet, that we were, saying negative things about them. Not at all. We were trying to have an open conversation so that the community understood why we were taking on this challenge.
I recall that. Actually, you mentioned this in the book, is that they had preferred that this was done the old way, where the contract was negotiated in private, or not private, but in a way that wasn't really open to the public, so that they could see and hear all the components of the contract. But I want to sort of dig into the sort of emotionality that a whole experience was like for everybody involved. And I want to sort of walk you through an exchange we had several years ago. I don't know if you recall, but we talked about how, with Mayor Castro leaving, with a new mayor coming in and Mayor Ivy Taylor, the consistent and the constant, there is another book out there, which is the playbook on how to, villainize anybody who goes after these benefits. You mentioned it in the book, and it was to create a boogie person, a boogeyman, in the form of anybody who would talk against or argue against the benefits that were created. And you played that part, and you had to. And that was the consistent theme in the several years going into this experience. While we changed mayors and council members, we were able to keep the 6. But the emotionality piece I want to ask is, you mentioned here that you would get pulled aside by folks who would, sometimes praise you, but sometimes berate you about this. And it was a binary choice. You were either pro-police or anti-police. And you even mentioned a conversation that you had on a Southwest flight with a woman who was spouse of a police officer, getting very emotional. And as somebody who, I remember, I wrote an op-ed supporting what we were doing, and even I would hear from friends who were police officers or firefighters, how can you be against this? So it really got blurred in that way. And you talk about that experience because you were the face that they were villainizing through ads, through radio, through TV. And that just must have taken a toll on you, even as you were trying to explain to folks that this wasn't about pro-police, anti-police.
Well, it was very hurtful. We did this in the best interest of the city, taking this on. I didn't want to leave that financial legacy that would eventually bankrupt the city. And I say that because it is a conversation that happens among city managers around the country. And I was watching what was happening on the East Coast and the West Coast as cities were entering bankruptcy over pension and healthcare for public safety. And in fact, Ray, I think you were one of the early council members early in the process who pointed out an article that appeared that was talking about cities in California.
November
and
2011, a Michael Lewis article about.
Yes, it was the Michael Lewis article. Yeah, I think it was in Vanity Fair. And it talked about a mayor who ran for office, he thought, to improve the park system, and ended up spending his whole time as mayor struggling with the police and fire pension and healthcare issues. But it was difficult. I mean, but what I did say to my employees was that I wasn't going to read or look at every commercial, every article that was written. We had to keep our focus. We weren't only working on that project. I was still in charge of the entire city organization, all 40 departments. And I had to keep my game face on and stay focused on bettering the community in all areas. And if you think about it, over that 6 years, we worked on 2 additional bond programs. We had to implement all of those major policy initiatives. We implemented pre-K for essay during all of this going on. So I didn't want to look at it. I did tell them, if there's something I really need to see, or if there's something that's threatening of me in terms of my personal safety, let me know. But otherwise, I want to ignore that. I want to stay focused on the facts and stay focused on the work that we have to do. And that was my personal strategy. My family knows that it was very difficult behind the scenes, but I didn't read all of that or look at all of those articles. There was a lot of nasty stuff, and social media contributed to that. There's no question. The police and fire unions actually had people that they would follow any good commentary that was put out about work that we were doing at City Hall, and had people lined up to put 5 negative comments about it, on social media. So they were very well organized, very well funded. They spent a lot of money and time and effort on those TV ads that they ran for the better part of a year. It was hurtful. It was negative because I think it damaged their reputation, but also hurt what we were trying to accomplish, which was in the best interest of the city's financials.
Okay, I want to ask one more question before going into the audience question. And it's something that you were able to recall because you went through the experience of negotiating, and we talked a lot of dollars and fact figures around the financial aspect of the contract. The piece that didn't really get as much airtime until the very end of the contract was the question that I think is percolating in city councils and city halls all across the country, which is around the disciplinary components of contracts. Because as we see, whether it's the social and racial equity and unrest that we see between members of the community and law enforcement, what happens in those protests is folks are asking for action to be taken. so that we can root out what could be bad officers who were on the streets. And we had our cases, and the discipline policy and language in the contract that we approved didn't get to adjust a few of the requested components that you and Chief McManus put up. You had a list of 7 that I recall trying as hard as I could to fight at the tail end of that contract that weren't able to reach the finish line. But we certainly tried to create some momentum around it. What do you recall about that? What do you think needs to happen on that contract to create some action around all the activism that we're hearing right now?
Yes. So the disciplinary issues, the 7 issues, were a priority as we began negotiations in 2014. We did the pre-work that you described and the legacy task force leading up, thinking that the public conversation about the data would lead us to a conclusion. But among that was changes in the disciplinary process as outlined in the contract. The Texas Local Government Code allows cities to have votes for whether or not there is collective bargaining, and that happened in San Antonio in 1974. And on a vote of about 10,000 to 3,000, by the way, voted for collective bargaining for police and fire. And then back even before that, in 1947, they voted for a code called Chapter 143 that gives arbitration and civil service protection specifically for police and fire. That vote was 6,000 to 5,000. And over the years, what had happened in San Antonio with the 143 protection and collective bargaining, the chief had very little authority over terminating bad officers, officers who had done egregious things. For example, the entire file of the police officer is not admissible in arbitration. And in the arbitration process, it's an arbitrator that's not from San Antonio, someone brought in from the outside who can second guess and pass judgment on whether or not the chief made the right decision by terminating an officer. And there were some that I was mortified with some of the decisions. I couldn't believe it. And a few of the officers, we believe, the chief and I thought, they're a danger to the community. And so we'd put them on desk duty because the arbitrator would put them back. This isn't the union has suggested that it was incompetent representation before the arbitrator. Come on. There was never a question about the fact as to whether or not the individual had done what they did. But in some cases, if the infraction happened more than 180 days before the chief found out about it, then that was a technicality that would throw that out. I understand that there should be a time frame, but how about when the chief finds out about it? Because sometimes that information has been suppressed or hasn't risen to the top to figure out how to take that action. Officers, if they were suspended, were allowed per the collective bargaining agreement to use their comp time or other leave time to fulfill the suspension as opposed to actually be off duty. So those things still need to be changed. We were not able to get it. And you'll recall, Ray, I wasn't happy with the police mediated settlement, but I know a majority of the council members had grown weary of the fight over a couple of years. They wanted to be done with it. We were able to achieve a compromise on the healthcare piece, save money. They gave us 2 years on the evergreen clause from 10 to 8. To me, that didn't really make much difference. It really needs to be less than a year. That is much more typical because an evergreen clause is so that if you're negotiating and you're close but you aren't quite done, you have a period of time where things continue so you can wrap up your negotiations. It was never intended to be, I don't like you, I don't like where you're going with this negotiating strategy, I'm going to wait you out. And that's basically what they said to me. So what needs to still happen is addressing the disciplinary changes in the contract. And there are a couple of ways to do it. It could be negotiated. I don't have a high degree of confidence in whether or not that can be accomplished, just given how difficult they were on the changes we made in the mediated settlement. I have confidence in the staff. I'm not convinced that the union is going to cooperate. I don't think they feel any pressure to do so. And the other way is for the community to say, you know what, we want a different system. This may not be working for us anymore. Maybe we shouldn't have this civil service protection with an outside arbitrator second guessing the chief or overturning his decisions, and maybe collective bargaining isn't working for us here anymore. So there are some options, but it definitely does need to be addressed. And I recall that was the major reason you voted against that mediated settlement back in 2016.
Yeah, and I think with all things, with the police and the fire and the contract, and the reason it is such a difficult thing to take on, because kicking the can down the road seems like a very easy choice to make if you don't want to deal with the tough pressure that it takes to go up against the information campaign that happens, whether it is a pro-police or anti-union or anti-police, and you get put into these boxes. And you, unfortunately, for several years had to be the front cover of the box that they wanted to put you in as the villain in that experience. And actually, one of the questions that comes from the audience, which was in those years, and you talk about it a little bit in this book, but it was just handling pressure, a lot of it. And it was still running the organization. It was these external factors. And the question is how did you handle the pressure that, when you were going through these negotiations, through that experience that you outline in the book?
Well, my pressure release is running. So I could go out, clear my head, go for a nice long run in the morning, and be set and ready to go for the day. And my family support, they'd bring me back to center as to what's most important. And I can recall many times where Mike and I would go out and grab a bite to eat when I'd get home late at night, and I'd be bemoaning the fact that, gosh, they did some awful things again today, and it never failed. Someone would walk up to the table that I didn't know and say, hey, I like what you're doing. I appreciate what you're trying to do for the community. Thank you, and stay the course. And Mike would just look at me and say, see, you're doing the right thing. Keep going. It is. And that would, motivate me to do even more. I recall even walking down the street one day, and some man just yelled out the window of his car, "You go, girl." And thumbs up sign. So there was a lot of support. And even from the rank and file, this wasn't about, even when we filed the lawsuit, which was to try to get the unions to come to the table and negotiate, rank and file would pull me aside and say, I know you're doing what you think is best for the city, but don't tell the union I said that. And I saw an article, I think it was in the New York Times or the Post, within the last week or so, that talked about why are good cops allowing this to happen and continue? And I would hope that it's time for them to speak up and say enough is enough. We're partners in this in the community, and it's all of our community. Another thing, though, is that our officers don't live in San Antonio. Only 40% of our firefighters live inside the city of San Antonio, and less than half of our police officers live in the city. And the city is prohibited from requiring residency by state law. So we did, you'll recall, offer housing incentives to try to get first-time home buyers and our new officers to move inside the city. But we had a few takers, but it's still less than half of our personnel live in San Antonio.
Well, here's another question actually about personnel that comes from the audience, which is this, the question of the ability for you to change what was true in 2006, which was do not find anybody internally for this job. What we've now gone through the last several years, you create an organization where there is a deep bench of high quality staff that is now assistant city manager, and some that, if you think about it, it's like a coaching tree. You've been part of under your tutelage, and I think they've described this about Coach Popovich that you talk about. But now you've got folks who worked under you. They're managing other large cities all across the country. But specifically, I want to ask about your elevation of women within the organization, within the profession. As somebody who was, you talk about this in the book. You sometimes felt like when you were being recruited, you were worried that perhaps you were being recruited because they needed a woman to be part of the pack. Like, that has changed dramatically, and you sort of talk about in the book is you want to make sure that that was a personal component that you were interested in. So tell us more about that and why.
Yeah, so there wasn't a bench, and we put several programs in place: an executive leadership program, a first-line supervisory program, a mid-management academy, and also a women's leadership mentoring program. And it has been highly successful. I read a note today from one of the mentees that I worked with over time. She wrote me a lovely note and asked me to personalize my book for her, and talked about what she was able to learn in the process. And so our mentoring program has been very effective, and we've been able then to retain and promote many of the women that have graduated from the program. And what it is pairing up a junior member of staff with maybe a mid-manager or a supervisor with an executive female in the city organization. And we would meet at least monthly, sometimes twice a month, to talk about issues and thoughts they had about how and what they wanted to do next, or how they could be more effective in the job that they were currently in. As well as bring in outside speakers. I know Jenny Carnes texted me last week and said that she was speaking at the next women's leadership program, bringing in women from the outside, from the private sector as well, to talk with our staff about their challenges. Because oftentimes women think, gosh, I'm trying to manage my job, I'm trying to go to school to complete a master's degree, and I have children at home, so I'm managing childcare, and I'm also a spouse, and how do I do all of this? And they realize that most of us have all gone through that same situation, and that they're not alone, and that they can learn things from other women that have already done that. But I'm really proud of that program because, as I said, we've been able to retain so many women, and a good percentage of them have achieved a promotion within the city organization. And when I left, of the top 100 executives in the city organization, 43% were women. And I know that Eric's made several promotions as well. He promoted Maria Villagomez to deputy manager. I had the privilege of promoting Maria 3 times. And she was most recently promoted to deputy. Dr. Colleen Bridger, who we hired several years ago, 3 years ago, as public health director, was promoted to assistant city manager and is now doing both jobs for the city. So, and Lori Houston, I found in the public works department and promoted her several times as well to the center city office, to assistant city manager. Just excellent women within the city organization that have excelled. And likewise, as you know, all 6 of my deputy and assistant managers applied for the job, were interviewed by the council, and the council.
I remember that we had in on the interviews. They could be a city manager at any city that they chose.
In any city.
Yeah.
And Peter Zanoni did go on to be, he was offered the position in Corpus Christi. He's there. TC Broadnax, who I recruited to San Antonio from Florida, in 06. Left. He worked with us for 5 years. He left to become city manager of Tacoma, Washington, and then called me a couple of years ago and said, hey, I'm being recruited by Dallas. What do you think? And I said, go for it. If you want to come back to Texas, and I encourage you to do so, go for it. And so he's now up there in Dallas. Penny Postoke Ferguson was an assistant manager I recruited here from Kansas. She worked here for about 5 years. She's now county manager in Johnson County, Kansas. Jesus Garza worked in our city manager's office. He's in Victoria. Texas. So yeah, I'm really proud of the staff that have gone on to be managers.
Any council member who's gone through City Hall, there's so many of the names that you've listed of folks who are just unquestionably strong at their job. Maria Villagomez is somebody that any council member will tell you is just so incredibly sharp and knows the budget forwards and backwards. Somebody who I think you've been elevating and into a department, David McCary. I'm a huge David McCary fan over at Solid Waste for things that folks don't appreciate, which is having your trash and your recycling picked up. The kind of progress we made on that is incredible. One last question here before we're out of time, but I think it's one that maybe just is really about where you've come from, your upbringing, because it asks, can you share traits about your upbringing that make you determined and the kind of leader that can take on the kind of challenge that says, I'm putting it all out on the line, really for the kind of thing that stepping up you had to do for the contract and the 6 years of putting up with that. It takes a steel spine. So they want to know, can you share traits about your upbringing that make you the person you are?
Well, as you know, Ray, I'm the oldest of 7 children from a working middle-class family. I was often in charge. One of my younger siblings accuses me of trying to be the city manager of the family. But I can count. I can count to a majority among the siblings when we have decisions to make among care for our parents or any family kind of decision. So I was often in charge. My parents had high expectations for us as well. They wanted us and required us to do well in school, to be active in outside activities, whether it be sports or other kinds of organizations. I was a Girl Scout, still am a Girl Scout. We always say we're always a Girl Scout. And then in high school and college, took on leadership positions there as well. But what I would say to people, and I tell young managers and people aspiring to be managers, is that you need to step outside of your comfort zone. When I started in this business more than 40 years ago, there were very few women. I was the first woman in every position I earned, but for the city manager position here in San Antonio, there had been a woman before me. There were very few when I started in this career, and most women were either in social services or personnel, and I wanted to work in finance, on budgeting, deal with public safety and capital construction. And it really wasn't my educational background specifically. I wasn't educated as an engineer, but I wanted to take on different types of responsibility. So stepping out of that comfort zone, taking on something new, new challenges, and learning new ways to approach city business. So having a variety of experience and being confident enough that if you fail, you can pick yourself up and keep going. And every challenge that I took on didn't come out exactly as I thought it would, but you learn from each one of those and you can build on that. So by the time I came to San Antonio with 30 years of experience, I had quite a varied experience and thought I had seen it all. And then I came here, I hadn't seen it all, but we worked hard. And it really was an honor and a privilege to serve as city manager of San Antonio. Mike and I still live here. We love the community and we worked hard to make it better.
Well, I know that there's a lot of folks who are going to be eager just to pick up the book to really find out what happened in that corner office at the city manager's city hall space for that long. And I will say, one of the things I picked up as new is that when you were in a job, you weren't in there for a few years, then looking to escape. You talked about Kalamazoo being over a decade, Phoenix over a decade, and San Antonio 14 years. And I think we're all just really grateful that that you've stayed a San Antonian. You're working on even the campaign to re-up on pre-K for SA, something I know you're proud of, that we all, as members of the council, are excited about investing in San Antonio, and from our 4-year-olds all the way to the work that's happening throughout the city now, as you've elevated so many members of the team and the organization. So just want to ask, as you're closing, you've got a lot of talented folks who are still within the organization. And right now we're dealing with the budget and the budget season, certainly a kind of moment of austerity But so just for you to finish off in thinking how they might, words of wisdom for how they might get through difficult times, because this pandemic certainly has been a difficult time, a challenge for folks who are leading cities. And so it certainly might be an opportunity for you to check in as well.
Actually, Ray, I think they're doing an outstanding job. Eric Walsh, my successor, was my deputy. Maria Villa-Gomez and I worked very closely together. Ben Gorzel, Carlos Contreras, Rod Sanchez, and now David McCary and Dr. Bridger as new assistant city managers. They are for best in class. And that's really what we tried to achieve, having best in class in all levels of the organization, while at the same time we groom successor leaders. They have a tough time this year. I've talked with Eric and Maria several times about the budget challenges, but they're up to the task. And I'm impressed with what they're doing. And they know to stay focused on the principles and the financial policies that we were able to put in place over the past decade and a half, and I know they'll stay true to that. And it appears to me that they have council support. So I'm very pleased and proud of the work that they're doing. And I want to say one more thing about the library system, because the library staff, and also a plug for the advisory board, we work together in adding numerous branch libraries over the years and new programs, and I was proud to be an advocate for the library system. It's especially important in San Antonio because so many people don't have access to home computers and to necessary books and resources. Even for this book, I told Ramiro that I went to the Texana room and pulled out all those newspaper articles from back in 1988 to educate myself on what happened back then. There are a lot more stories even in those than I couldn't include them in the book. There were so many. But the library system has done an excellent job for the community and is an important resource. So my compliments to the library system, to the Library Foundation, and of course to the San Antonio Book Festival. What a great event that has become for the community.
Thank you so much for highlighting them. And I think it's because of their work putting this together that we've had an opportunity to talk about you now as an author. And so this is a new experience for you, one that I know that you've been doing a lot of these interviews, talking about what's in the contents of this book. I think you've really left a real legacy with this for folks who are trying to learn San Antonio, because as you described, there's not a lot of content out there to really understand the ins and the outs and how things come to the point where we can say something like you were able to say, which is in the life of the contract, which is the centerpiece of the book. Now, after 5 years, we are able to save something like $100 million to the San Antonio taxpayers, which is real change. And it's not defunding the police. It is reprioritizing in a way that is, supporting all of the other services that our constituents, that San Antonians count on, in a way that shouldn't be controversial. But nevertheless, there's controversy in this book that you described, that you walk us all through, and we're grateful to do it. I want to just say, in closing, if I can here, that you said in the book that you are in the business of wanting to make cities to be better places for people to live, learn, and work. And having seen alongside you with a number of other council members coming in 2011. I remember that was the same year Diego Bernal and I came in, thinking about the kind of work that needed to happen to create that kind of city. We certainly had ways and ideas to make it happen, but it has to be actuated. And for a plug for professionally managed cities, you've been a really great colleague to get to work with, leading the consistent progress that our city is making. So thank you, Cheryl. As we close up, just offer you anything else that you'd like to say before we say goodbye to the folks who are tuning in.
No, just thank you, Ray. It was my privilege to work with you during your 8 years. You're one of the longest serving city council members, since that was changed back in 2008 to allow council members to serve 4 2-year terms. Maybe someday we can get to 2 4-year terms for the council members, but we'll save that conversation for another day. Thank you very much, Ray, and thank you to the libraries for organizing this event.
Absolutely. Thank you once again to the San Antonio Public Library, the San Antonio Book Festival, and to you all, and of course to the San Antonio Library Foundation for helping to put this event, and to the folks who are joining us tonight. You all have a good night.